everyone. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Wendy Dwyer, the chair of the Victorian branch of the Australian Garden History Society. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet tonight and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you for supporting the Victorian branch by signing up for this lecture tonight. And we'd like to welcome the many visitors who are also joining us tonight. We've had really good publicity for this talk, so I've got people from all around the country, which is great. If you're not a member of Australian Garden History Society, our mission is to promote awareness and conservation of significant gardens and cultural landscapes through engagement, research, advocacy and activities. So if you're not a member, I encourage you to go onto our website and join up. It's quite simple. Next year, we'll be offering a full range of activities and events, and I can assure you, you won't want to miss out because Victoria's been starved of activity for quite a while. Okay, now before I introduce the speaker tonight, just like to remind members of our last event for the year, which is a real face-to-face picnic with our patron, Professor Tim Entwistle, who heads up the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne and Cranbourne. And a new arid garden has just been recently opened, which has an interesting history in relation to its plant collection. So Tim's going to talk to us and walk us through the garden, followed by a BYO picnic on the 8th of December, that's Tuesday the 8th, 5:30 for a 6 o'clock start. You need to book in on Try Booking. It's on the last newsletter or the website. We have to limit it to 50. It's a free event, but because of the COVID restrictions still, we can only have 50. So don't miss out. So before we start the lecture, just a few housekeeping points. I muted everybody, I think, or we'll do it again. Just to make sure we don't get any background noises. And I ask you to stay muted while we have the talk, and then you can unmute at the end. We're recording, so if you don't want to be seen on the recording, please turn off your video. And if you want to ask Max a question at the end, type it into the chat function and send it to me, and I'll read them out at the end of the talk. Okay, so tonight we're very fortunate to have MaxBourke speak to us. He's a very well-known ACT member from AGHS. He's been around for quite a while in various roles within the society. As the flyer said, Max has had an extensive career as a scientist, a journalist, an environmentalist, culminating in being the first CEO of the Australian Heritage Commission. In 2004, Max was awarded an Order of Australia for his contribution to conservation and Australia's cultural heritage. And very recently, he was given honorary life membership of ICOMOS. I think it was last week. For over 40 years, Max has helped rehabilitate and care for a private arboretum in coastal New South Wales and has a real passion for trees. So tonight his topic is Out of the Woods, Trees and the Evolution of Arboreta. Thank you, Max. And we'll just get Linda to get the slideshow going.
Would you like to speak first, Max, or will I just bring up the PowerPoint?
He's muted, I think. You'll have to unmute yourself, Max.
Right. Sorry about that. Bit of a klutz at this communications technology. I think my high point was in the age of the ringing telephone, but I seem to be going backwards. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me tonight, and I'm not sure I include Helen Page in that because I think she put me up to it, so I'm not sure to thank her or grumble, but hello, Helen. I guess tonight I want to just go through why I think garden history or why I think arboreta are important to garden historians, because I think arboreta have touched on and influenced gardens as we know them, particularly public domains, for now 150, 100, nearly coming up towards 200 years. And arboreta have been a very significant, perhaps unknown effect on the public domain of gardens and street trees at least. I've had a lifelong interest in trees. I'm not sure whether it was because of my simian ancestors, but somehow or other I've been fascinated by trees all my life and have been happily growing them for many, many decades. So I'll move straight into the slides, and I'll just say, if you wouldn't mind, Linda, thank you very much to bring this first slide up.
And
I'm going to try and focus this talk, which is a variant of one I've done before, and essentially on the way in which, as I said, the interconnections between various garden designers and arboreta have affected garden design internationally over many years. So the first slide, please.
Oops.
Next slide.
Yes. No.
I'll finish up talking about this arboretum. This is the National Arboretum, Canberra. That slide's about 5 years ago. I happen to like this particular slide of many hundreds of slides of the arboretum, only because of the colours in it. It reflects, it was a photograph taken in autumn in which you can see the reds and the yellows of various young species, even in their early days, with that central great landform in the middle in shade and light. It always reminds me of those of you who know the work of Charles Jenks, the American-English, Amero-English philosopher and garden designer who designed the Garden of Cosmic Speculation at Dumfries in Scotland. But this too is just a piece of landforming for the sake of landforming by the designer's Taylor Cullity Lethlean. And I'll come back to that in the end. Next slide. In about 1996, I was invited to give a talk to the Linnaean Society in London. And walking up the stairs to give this talk, I was impressed to see one of my great heroes hidden away on one of the corners of the staircase. And it's one of the very few paintings of John Claudius Loudon. Now, Loudon, of course, was very famous for a variety of things, amongst which was that he married the author of the sci-fi, early Victorian sci-fi book called The Mummy, which became The Mummy. And it was an amazing book, and Loudon and his wife Jane Webb went on to found this amazing collection of writings and publications, including the Gardener magazine. But his written work with Jane Webb was truly extraordinary. I think I like him because we both share left-handedness and the affliction of arthritis, but I also like that he brought to philosophy about gardens a kind of new approach. His work appeared in Australia in very large numbers. It just happened to coincide with a lot of migration to Australia, and his encyclopedias of both gardening and of agriculture were brought out here in, I believe, in their hundreds, and many copies exist today, and they're wonderful documents worth a look. But the document that almost drove him mad and was the 8 volumes of Arboretum et Fruitacetum Britannicum. It certainly brought him to the edge of financial ruin. However, it was the book that coined the word, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, arboretum, and that is the attribution. It sounds like a Latin word, but it was made up by Loudon in 1838. He wrote this amazing 8-volume book, which you can now also get in 1 volume, and it is a monstrous, I think you'd call it, piece of work, trying to describe the trees and shrubs of Great Britain. He attracted the attention in writing that of a very wealthy industrialist in Derby in England. And that industrialist, James Strutt, commissioned Loudon to, as it were, put his money where his mouth was and design an arboretum for him. That beautiful arboretum, next slide please. That beautiful arboretum, which was started in 1838 or just 1839 and finished in 1840 amazingly quickly, is today an absolute glory. It's only 6 hectares, but it's very, very close to the centre of the city of Derby in northern central England. Its significance is that, in my view, its key significance is not only was it a beautiful space and the first, as far as I know, of a public domain, I stress public domain, which emphasised the structure of trees and the use of trees as the key and principal planting scheme. But 19 years after it was planted, he was visited by Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, I'm sure all garden historians know Olmsted, and he's worked both on Central Park in New York and what is called the fabulous Emerald Necklace of Boston. Those were 2 fantastic works, and Olmsted himself acknowledged both Loudon and this place, the Arboretum at Derby, and Paxton's work at Birkenhead Park. When he returned to America, he wrote a book about his studies in England and Europe, for that matter. But these 2 structures, Birkenhead Park and by Paxton and Derby Arboretum, figure highly, significantly in that. And of course, the work of Olmsted, not only in Central Park and Boston, but Olmsted and the dynasty he created led to some 2,000 public domain designed public spaces. And the influence of this humble little 6-hectare arboretum in Derby can't be overestimated. It certainly led on to this sort of design and this sort of public space, both in streetscapes and in public parks, and was of a major importance in world garden design over the next century and indeed today. This arboretum was created purely for recreation. It was created so that Strutt's employees could go somewhere after they'd been to church on Sunday morning. Don't forget they worked 6 days a week in those days, Sunday being their day of rest, and they'd go to church, and then he hoped they would go to the Arboretum and relax and commune with nature or whatever. The next slide, please. The second great influence that I wanted to talk about is this man, Charles Weston, sometimes mistakenly called Thomas because that was his first name, but he was known to everyone as Charles Weston. Charles Weston came along, it was an amazing, truly amazing man. He was a product of the apprenticeship system of foresters and arborists, and he started off his life as an apprentice gardener in England, but he quickly moved later on, next slide please, to Drumlanrig Castle, where he came under the influence of Thompson, who were one of the great garden designers of Scotland and England in the mid-Victorian period, mid to late Victorian period. There, the training for management of plants and was absolutely comprehensive. During the days, the boys, and they were all men who were apprentices, worked on practical issues, everything from composting to pruning and grafting and all the other techniques that were necessary for a good gardener. But they at night they would undertake lectures that were really extraordinary from our point of view, but they weren't extraordinary if you think about the Scottish Enlightenment and the way in which Scots love self-improvement. And Weston even recalls lectures on feminism and the early suffragette movement being part of their political cult lectures at night. After he'd been through this education process, he applied for, and with great enthusiasm, Thomson wrote him an extraordinary reference. He was given a very good job and he decided to migrate to Australia at the end of the century. And he firstly fetched up in private sector, but then quite quickly became the head gardener at Government House in Sydney and hooked up with Charles Maiden, who really quickly saw that this was a very, very well-educated man. Without what you'd call formal education, he was educated through the apprenticeship system in England and Scotland. He'd learnt genetics, although in those days it wasn't called genetics. Genetics hadn't been invented as a term. It was called Mendelism, and after Mendel. And when Weston applied for and got the job that he ultimately got in Canberra, designing the arboretum or designing the streetscapes and landscaping of Canberra, he was referred to by Charles Maiden as the best Mendelian I've ever met, which was reflected in his, I guess in his later years after he retired from Canberra. He went back to Sydney and bred flowers. It was a considerable contributor to flower breeding up there. Next slide, please. When 18 months after Weston arrived in Canberra, this is pretty well what it looked like. This is a photo taken by him from the top of Mount Ainslie, looking to the southeast from the top of Mount Ainslie, looking towards, for those of you who know Canberra, looking towards Kingston. And the next slide, please. Whereas this is one looking across to Black Mountain from the top of Mount Ainslie. You can see how they've already fenced out the area, that V-shaped darker spot on the mid-right. You can see that that's what became Hague Park, and the line running along the near edge of it is the alignment of Limestone Avenue, for those of you who know Canberra. Black Mountain's in the centre, and the National Arboretum is just off to the left of Black Mountain, the rather dark coloured hill with a, I think that's actually a cloud shadow over the top of it. Most of those lands had been cleared or were cleared for grazing, even up a significant part way up, as you can see, up the summit of Black Mountain. And throughout the area, ring barking was practiced. Next slide, please. And ring barking was the centre of Charles Weston. Absolutely hated, as you can see, ringbark trees in his background. He was a passionate lover of trees, and he thought it was an awful way to kill them anyway. But he devoted his energy, besides riding his motorbike and sidecar, he devoted his energy to planting trees. And his plantations started off with, given his background, with an experimental plantation, which we still see a very significant part of it exists today, and forms part of the Yarralumla Peninsula in Canberra. Next slide, please. Weston, the plantings that probably are least accessible but most interesting, once a month are opened up by the Friends of ACT Trees, are the beautiful collection of signature plantings that Charles Weston, who is standing here on the far left with the moustache and the trilby hat, watching someone from the Institution of Engineers planting trees in Manuka in 1926, just before he retired. But his plantations were luckily saved by the wonderful Lindsay Pryor, later on, who was a golfer, who came up with this brilliant way of rescuing them by converting the core of them into a wonderful arboretum, but it's currently called Royal Canberra Golf Course. I learnt from the last head horticulturalist there that he believes, after some research on his part, that it has more tree species than any golf course in the world. Weston used this circular planting system for testing out species. It's a very interesting technique that was documented in 1926 by the Deputy Director of Kew Gardens as what's called the Nalder wheel, a system of testing out trees planted in concentric circles, the same species at different spacings as you go out. And it's a great way of testing the way in which trees behave in plantations. Weston's plantations were extremely valuable. They were a way of assessing not only what could grow, but what would grow well. In a sense, he was advancing the business of amenity tree forestry, which still hadn't occurred as a subset of academia. It was really Lindsay Pryor later on who brought it into being a practice that professional foresters used. Up until then, forestry was seen as a business for purely commercial production of trees, and forestry was not a route into what do you call amenity agriculture, amenity forestry, planting trees for streets. A lot of people, including a busload of people I had on a guided tour I did this afternoon around the Arboretum, have trouble believing that up until really very late in the 19th century, there were very few public parks. There were almost no street trees in streets. And the whole concept of planting streets and street trees owes a great deal, I think, to the concept of the arboreta. And these arboreta, which started at Derby, gradually spread in both the private, where they became a race by wealthy men, which was an interesting thing. Instead of having a race to see how many Lamborghinis you had, or collection of what your collection of Grange Hermitage was, there was quite a rush by wealthy men in the late 19th century to create private arboreta. And some of those arboreta still exist. There's some wonderful ones, particularly in the Adelaide Hills, that date back to wealthy people from Adelaide, some of whom were squatters, but many of whom were industrialists, like the Bar Smiths and others. They developed arboreta themselves. And these arboreta were essentially like a tree version of stamp collecting. The people were still, explorers were still collecting new species of trees in exotic places like China and Nepal and Japan. And they were coming into cultivation very quickly in Europe and England. But what is also surprising is a lot of them were coming into cultivation in Australia almost as quickly. When the great English gardener and horticulturalist Edward Veitch visited, his son John Veitch visited Sydney in the late 19th century, he was astonished at how quickly some of the species had got from China and Japan into Australia, and then at those days they were mostly going into private arboreta and private collections. But by 1878, the first big large-scale arboreta was being built in Australia for what became the second wave of arboreta. The first wave, as I said, was about recreation and amenity, and about collecting and just studying new species for their own benefit, for their own sake. The second wave occurred largely, and I'm very indebted and pleased to see my old mate John Dargavel online here, to his wonderful history of forestry and forest research. The work of the real work towards professionalising, taking it from a business through training by apprenticeship into the academic realm really only began in the late 19th century when forestry schools in universities began in both France and Germany initially, but then Oxford and Edinburgh quite later on, and ultimately in Australia in the early 20th century. So the next slide, please. By the turn of the century, they're the plantings that Weston was making. That's them today. They're Moroccan cypresses, Cupressus atlantica in Manica. They've been a bit, that was taken 20. I took that 20 years ago, but they're not looking quite as happy today after 5 years of serious drought has really hammered those trees. Next slide, please. So by the end of the 19th century, you had professionalising of forestry and university education of forestry. You also had the development of arboreta for a totally different purpose. Arboreta came to be used to do two things. One was to educate tertiary students in how to grow trees. And the second thing was to use as research laboratories by the emerging newish profession of forestry to test out which species might be used for a variety of purposes, principally for the purposes of growing commercial timber, but also for later on for amenity. So Australia arrives at the beginning of the 20th century, and we decide to build a national capital. And the Griffins, of course, won that prize, Marion and Wall, and they arrived after they had studied horticulture. They did some night classes with a wonderful German-American horticulturist called Wilhelm Müller, who wrote a book about the use of the native plants of Illinois, which was part of the lecture course that the two Griffins, Wall and Marion, undertook when they were in Illinois. So they came out with a sort of pre-prepared ideology that it was possible to use native species of trees. And Müller had very strongly advocated using native species of trees, which was running a bit against the prevailing fashion for importing trees from Asia, particularly Asia, and swapping trees around from different parts of the world. So Griffin arrives not only to implement his plan, and this is my favourite portrait taken on board the ship that Griffin arrived in with his friend John. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that they were actually ever friends, but John Smith Murdoch, the wonderful architect of Canberra, who designed some of the most beautiful, simple buildings in Canberra, as well as Old Parliament House. But he designed some fabulous weatherboard buildings, which are elegant post-Georgian buildings. He was the lead architect, and despite an instruction, which I've read in the archival files from his boss, to the contrary, he was told not to go and welcome Mr. Griffin when he arrived. He got on the train at Queanbeyan, went up to Sydney and welcomed Wall when he arrived, and presumably took him back to Canberra on the train, and they began their work in earnest. 2 years or 18 months before this date he arrived, Charles Weston, whom we saw earlier, had begun planting not only his nursery, but his trial plantings to see, and he made up a series of arboreta, not only the one in Yarralumla, but also a number of test plots all around Canberra, some of which still exist in various forms. And he began planting, miraculously, he began planting in cooperation, and at times after a bit of an arm wrestle, because Weston actually knew quite a lot about trees, and I'm not sure that while Griffin did know a great deal about trees, he knew what he liked, but there's some evidence that his passion for growing species didn't include a serious study of whether or not they'd grow. Hence, we have this wonderful plantation. For those who might know, it was almost destroyed in a fire last summer of Californian redwoods near the airport, which was planted on Griffin's firm instructions, despite Weston telling him they wouldn't grow. Well, they were both part right. They're there, but only just, and they're probably the most scraggly, awful-looking group of redwoods you'll ever see in Australia, compared to, say, the streets of Beechworth or somewhere like that, where they are in splendid glory. So Griffin arrives to plantations, and he decides, next slide please, he decides in his, the last drawing he made in 1915 of the Canberra, he decides that he wants to see, he was a very interesting man, Griffin, a restless mind. He went, in 1914, the first meeting of the British Society for the Advancement of Science was held in Melbourne. It was the first meeting outside of England of the British Society for the Advancement of Science. And at that meeting, a concept that was then new to science was shared amongst all the scientists present, and it was the concept of Continental Drift. And Gondwanaland was reported on as a first for science. Griffin came back to Canberra and decided to create a Gondwana Arboretum. And this was his drawing of that Arboretum. You might, I hope, can just read Australia in the centre. There was going to be, in that peninsula, sticking out into the lake, going north, matched by South Africa coming down from the north down into the centre, and Europe over in the northwest of that, Africa to the left, and North America running around the foot of Black Mountain. Where Europe and Africa are the edges of our modern Arboretum. Africa sits, it was never built by this Arboretum, other than the test sites in the centre, which were Weston's test sites, which became the Yarralumla Nursery today, the English Garden in the centre, and below Australia there is where the Royal Canberra Golf Course is, and the bulk of Weston's plantings for his test arboreta. He went on to use the evidence he got from growing those trees quite widely, and it became part of his methodology for working out what would grow and what needed to be planted in Canberra. He at times clashed, but he managed to get on. I think he was a rather stoical man, but he at times managed to get on with a much more flamboyant Griffin. And he was although he was an adoptee of, he wasn't strictly a Scot, I think he adopted a lot of Scotland's sort of doer, get on with the job approach in anything I can read. He unfortunately wrote very little other than the most wonderful copper plate ledgers, which he kept of his seed collection in Canberra, which the ACT branch under Tony Burns some years ago had digitised so that those are accessible online. So there was the idea of an arboretum there. Next slide, please. But then by the early 20s, Charles Lane Poole had arrived, and the beginnings of professionalisation within Australia of forestry management really took off. Now, this man was without any doubt, a very, very difficult man. But he, particularly his ability to write, he became a federal public servant, and he used to very happily write letters on his own behalf to various state premiers and tell them what was right and what was wrong. And you can imagine a forestry public servant sending a letter to the premier of Victoria or wherever and telling him how to suck eggs went down fairly badly in some cases, and led to him having considerable difficulties in getting a national education system for forestry going. Nevertheless, he pursued and he set up the forestry school in Canberra, which and the beginnings of what later became the forestry and timber bureaus of, and still later CSIRO forestry research. All of that process was in part kicked off by this extraordinary man. He was a forester who encouraged his students to learn by doing. They were trained, as he had been, to wear uniforms in the German manner of young forestry students. Puttees and uniforms were worn, and they went out and planted the 22 arboreta that were planted in Canberra and one at Jerilderie on the border with Victoria, all to test different species. The search was on by then big time to test species, the search for a great softwood that would grow in Australia. South Australia, the colony of South Australia, had jumped the gun and planted an arboretum, which still exists up in the north, north of Snowtown, up in the, getting in an extraordinary arboretum which still exists, even though the trees are in moderately bad condition. They, like a lot of the successful species that came out, almost everywhere was Pinus radiata as meeting the demands for people. But these arboreta, these scientific arboreta, nearly all of them in southern Australia showed that Pinus radiata was going to be the standout production species. So those arboreta are scattered all around Australia. There are dozens of arboreta, mostly started by either the late colonial or early state forestry services of arboreta, some of which, very sadly, one of the most beautiful of them was destroyed in the horrific fires at the beginning of this year up near Tumbarumba, the Pilot Hill Arboretum, which had, besides different cultivars of Pinus radiata and other conifers, they had the most exquisite stand of Pinus lambertiana, the snow pine, and that arboreta unfortunately was totally destroyed by the fires at the beginning of this year. Charles Lane Poole, I don't think was particularly interested in what we'd call amenity arboreta or amenity forestry for that matter. He was more interested in production forestry. He was very interested in preserving and conserving the management of the good management of forestry trees and of propagating and producing good, well-trained, well-rounded students. Next slide, please. The only surviving arboretum from that period is the Bendura Arboretum, which is still there, thanks to the fabulous work of a wonderful group of old foresters in Canberra who twisted the government's arm to keep these, even though they're within the domain of a national park. There was a lot of pressure to take them down in the interests of just having native species, but that battle was fought and won, and they're today protected. They have removed, I think, 2 species that were thought to be going a bit weedy to protect the environment, but it's been replanted, and it's a wonderful sight. Any of you who come to Canberra, get in touch with me and I'll give you directions for this, a bit difficult to get to, but wonderful walk to the Bendura Arboretum. And happily, it was the only one of all those arboreta that survived the 2003 fires. So it's well worth going to, and a wonderful example of what I call the second phase arboreta. That is the phase that became the scientific and educational phase. Next slide, please. Sadly, as I said, they were all destroyed in the fires of 2003. And this was, I was involved with a team of foresters who, we did the last measurement of this Blundell's Creek Arboretum just after, I think it was 2004, before all these trees were pulled down. They're all badly burnt and they were not going to ever recover, and they were all taken down. Next slide, please. However, after the fire and the fire which swept up into Canberra and destroyed 500 homes and terrorised many inhabitants and caused a considerable loss of life, human and animal life, there was a bit of a hiatus and a period where quite a bit of reflection as to what should be done in Canberra. And at that stage, a committee, of course, was set up and to consider various propositions. It was interesting that the key proposition that became public and political at the time was a desire to create on the site of the old pine forest at Dairy Farmers Hill. The idea was to create a national arboretum. This idea was met with derision by then members of the opposition. It was met with some querulousness by the community, but our then Chief Minister, John Stanhope, absolutely championed it and decided that come hell, and took a lot of political pain for doing so. And a competition was called to design the Arboretum, and it was won by Melbourne's fabulous TCL, Taylor Cullity Lethlean, who of course did your superb Cranbourne Gardens, and in Adelaide did the wonderful North Terrace, amongst dozens of other terrific works they've done, and including our Australian National Botanic Gardens, some work too recently. So TCL did this work and came up with this design which won the competition, called 100 Forests, 100 Gardens. The site is 240 hectares, so it's quite a large site. It's about 4 kilometres long. At its widest part, it's about 2 kilometres wide. TCL worked in partnership with the very good Sydney firm of Tonkin Zuleika Greer, the architects, and they came up with this incredible building, the visitor centre, and a separate building for private events. The main building here, you're looking out at the opening of the Arboretum, at which it was a truly wonderful occasion. The choir in the background, and they were scattered all around this floor so that you had singers in groups of 4 or 5 scattered right through the audience. And what they did was, there were a group of choirs that sang this, and they sang as the sun rose over the dawn you can see coming up there in the background. As the sun rose, they sang in Latin the 100 species of trees which were planted, the names of the 100 species of trees, in a most moving and wonderful evocation of the forest. Next slide, please. That's the sun coming up over the Arboretum on that morning in February 2013 at the opening of the Arboretum. You can get a feel for the importance of the site because you're looking straight back along Lake Burley Griffin there. Next slide, please. So the other building on the site is Margaret Whitlam. This is a very early photograph taken with that incredible Charles Jenks-like landform. Don't tell Taylor Cullity and Lethlean I called it that, but I suspect they might have got an idea or two from Charles Jenks's work for these fantastic landforms they made. That photo there is showing the Margaret Whitlam Pavilion, which is the space where we do all the private events in the National Arboretum. And the top of the hill there is the remains of a few trees that survived the terrible fires of both 2001 and 2003. Again, of course, they were Pinus radiata, because that's what had been grown on this site for 70 odd years. There'd been commercial forestry grown on this site. The site to the right, that basin to the right of the Margaret Whitlam Pavilion is the amphitheatre, which seats 6,000 to 7,000 people with a mobile stage planted in front. This is an early photo and the trees are still in guards, but it gives a nice, clean idea of the layout of the trees. Next slide, please. The Arboretum has, this again is an even earlier slide, taken in springtime. This time you can just see the flowers of the Yoshino cherries in the foreground when they were very, very, very small coming out. At the top of the Arboretum, there are a number of pieces of artwork scattered through this Arboretum. The one I most like is this great big evocation of Dorothea McKellar's. It's actually in her fabulous cursive script, The White Brown Land from My Country, of course. And I suspect it's the sculpture that appears in most Canberra photos of weddings these days. On some Saturdays, there are lineups of people waiting to get photographed in front of it. I'm not quite sure why. So the idea of Taylor Cullity left lean was 100 forests, 100 gardens. That was realised in 102.5 hectare blocks, or roughly plus or minus a few hundred square metres, 2.5 hectare blocks, on which each of which was one species of tree planted. They are roughly 60% introduced species and 40% native species. Nearly 40% of the overall species are rare or endangered in the wild, according to the IUCN criteria. So this site has become a mixture of both aesthetic beauty, the original intention of Arboreta, scientific study. We have quite a lot of scientific research on some parts of it. And because it's a 21st century Arboretum, this one has a third and sadder task, and that is conservation. Conservation has unfortunately become the only way many species of trees, just like zoos, are heading. If we want to see some species survive, they're going to survive only in zoos. And this happens to be, for that purpose, a tree zoo. Very sad, but there is no other way around it. Next slide. So looking back out over from the high on the hill, Dairy Farmers Hill, looking over the Arboretum, you look to, in the mid-ground, beyond the first line of water, is Lindsay Pryor's Arboretum. He was the great forester who was trained and became a professional forester and was the first person really to take professional forestry into amenity forestry. He became the head of Parks and Gardens in the ACT long before he became Professor of Forestry. And it was to Weston and Pryor and many successors that we owe the great beauty of the street trees and other trees of Canberra, and indeed the private domain too, because those public domain spaces and trees had a big influence, as you can see in private gardens in older parts of Canberra, and even today in the emerging parts of Canberra. So you're looking from the newest Arboretum over the second oldest Arboretum, now actually named the Lindsay Pryor Arboretum, and happily announced in recent times that the National Capital Authority is going to spend some money and look after it about time, which is great. And looking to Charles Weston's Arboretum, the third strand in the back, which is where this story began in a sense. Next slide. This is a very early slide too of the National Arboretum, looking at the then unfinished visitor centre, which still hasn't have its cladding, and the early plantings of the Arboretum. And Margaret Whitlam should be in the middle there, but is not. Next slide, please. And looking south down in the very early days of the Arboretum, looking to the plantings down towards the south, some very interesting scientific experiments underway to keep alive it was determined to keep alive the spirit of scientific research. So the forestry people at ANU are conducting a quite large scale experiment on climate change and its impact. They're using as their models two interesting species of eucalypts, one which is a climate adapter and one which is a climate change avoider. And those two species of eucalypts are now happily growing, and they have various nasty things stuck into them, and watching over them and looking at them all the time to measure the effects of climate change on these two species, which both are eucalypts. One's Eucalyptus triandra, the red ironbark. The other's Corymbia maculata, the spotted gum. They both behave differently when it gets dry. We are hoping they'll get some clues as to how our national estate of forestry, particularly eucalypts, will cope with the changing climate. Next slide, please. The only part of the Arboretum which I'd say, again, I'd welcome any people from interstate to come and have a look that's different from what I described as single species, is one small 2.5 hectare plot, which is the Southern Tablelands Ecosystems Park. This is a site of, which is in effect a botanical garden purely of the species of the Southern Tablelands. There are about 25 species of the main species of trees and nearly 184 understory species of the 250 odd understory species that grow within the Southern Tablelands bioregion. It's run by volunteers, of which I'm proud to say I'm one, and it's a terrific way to get a glimpse or a look at all of the species, or the 80-odd% of the species that grow in the Southern Tablelands, which stretches from north central Victoria all the way up to about Goulburn, west out to about Young, and east to the escarpment of the Great Dividing Range. So it's a large bioregion, and if you want to get a handle on both the trees and understory plants, you can see them in this part of the National Arboretum. Next slide, please. That Arboretum, that part also includes our wonderful Indigenous garden. It's a garden that was planted with all of the species of Indigenous value just only 2 years ago that are used for both food and fibre sources. Here's a photo of Scott Sadler, the General Manager or the Chief Executive of the National Arboretum, Canberra. Wonderful guy who's also happens to be a Wiradjuri man, and he's one of the great managers, I believe, and is a fantastic horticulturalist. So he's very enthusiastic about this Indigenous garden and, of course, about the Arboretum in general. Next slide, please. So that's how Arboretum went from being places of amenity to places of science and finally to places of conservation. And I welcome any questions.
Had quite a few, Max, coming through. I'm just going to find them. Oops, where have they gone? Stuart and Colleen, you were asking a lot of questions.
Gee, Stuart, that's hard to believe.
They're only coming to me. So
I don't know what you mean.
a good one from Colleen was, what's the success rate of the first plantings at the National Arboretum?
Happily, pretty good. I'd be happy with it on my own Arboretum. I'd say most of the species had a 90+% success rate. A couple of species have turned out not to be suitable and have been removed. Most recently, sadly, Dracuna Draco, the dragon's blood tree, which I personally love as a tree and would love to have seen successful, but it particularly is that lovely planting that runs down King William Street in Adelaide. But Dracuna Draco, unfortunately, has one habit that we didn't foresee, despite some of the best horticulturalists and arborists in Australia making the selection. And that is, sulphur-crested cockatoos absolutely love its growing chip. And Dracuna Draco, or Dragon's Blood, grows as a monopodal tree for its first 5 to 10, 15 years. So you have this little flowering stump, which unfortunately sulphur-cresteds absolutely got stuck into and kept eating the top out of them and killing it. And despite putting guards, and which looked very unsightly, all sorts of guards and protection, we couldn't stop the bloody thing. So finally they were pulled out, and they've just been replaced by xanthorrheas, grass trees, and they look fantastic. The other species, again, this was a something we didn't foresee that failed. Well, you can call it fail, although I prefer to say it's what arboreta are there for, was a very new, everyone hears about Wallamai pines as new species in Australia. Well, in 1986 in Victoria, there was quote unquote discovered, although I'm sure Indigenous people had known they were there for 60,000 years. Anyway, whitefellas discovered Acacia ceruluscens, the buccan blue wattle, and gave it a species name, and it became a new species. And as far as I know, its first use as a horticultural species was a plantation on the Arboretum. It's a lovely tree, has blue foliage, blue-grey foliage, and white flowers, but unfortunately it does what a lot of wattles do, and that is grows like mad, grew up to about 8 metres very, very quickly, and then borers, which love wattles, got stuck into it and knocked them all over. So we've pulled that out, and another species will at some stage go into that spot too.
Another question from Stuart, I think this was, how well are or were the private arboreta in Australia documented compared with the institutional or public ones? And is that an area needing more focus and research, perhaps?
Well, I certainly could find very little documentation of them. It was all, the only documentation I found them under the wonderful guidance of John Dargable was were reports in various magazines and journals. There would be people who owned them would stand up and give a talk to various men's clubs about the sort of species they were growing. And they're unfortunately, that sort of documentation is extremely ephemeral and very hard to get hold of. And I managed to track down a few articles in the odd newspaper about them, some of the ones in Adelaide, some of the ones in Melbourne. There were a couple of really good ones in Western Melbourne and Western Melbourne and Eastern Melbourne. Then in the Dandenongs and what's that mountain out? I'm having a senior moment here.
Macedon.
Out to the west of Melbourne.
Yeah.
There were a few built there, and I'm sure John Hawker's managed to document some of those ones. There were a few in Tasmania, a couple in New South Wales, one in Western Australia I've found, but they weren't, they were private spaces, and I don't think the people who owned them thought that, they were bothering to document them.
Another comment was, what's the state of forestry education today, i.e., or is amenity forestry, i.e. arboreta, park, streets, etc., neglected compared with commercial forestry? And is market failure applying a bias to commercial production forestry training only?
I think John Dargable and I have wrung our hands for several decades about the state of forestry education. It's pretty bloody ordinary, actually, just like the state of agricultural education. I mean, most of the forestry schools have been closed down or wound back, and in the case of ANU, its forestry school is a postgraduate school. The one, I think, the one in Victoria is still an undergraduate school. I think I stand corrected on that. And they've become, it's become a very marginal occupation, right at a time when people seem to love wood and timber products and trees. And why aren't we training more foresters? I mean, I scratch my head in the same way about my business with agriculture, because we're not training agricultural scientists either, and at a time when we need them. So I don't understand that, but that's what's happening.
Max, you haven't told us about your private arboretum at all in Tilba. Would you like to tell us a bit about that?
It started off as it started back to front from this. It started as a conservation project 40 years ago this year. And we started planting species simply to, we bought a block of land, 28 hectares of land right on the coast that had three almost 100-year-old Pinus radiata trees on it. That was all. The only trees on this 28, nearly 29 hectares of land. And we set about, it was the era with sort of hippy-dippy people like me and others who were, we thought we were going to save the planet by planting things along the coast, and or at least save the coast. And I'm pleased to say I think we've saved a couple of kilometres of the coast. That there's an awful lot more to do. The original plantings were all local provenance natives. We used to collect the seeds from, don't bother telling the NPWs, from various national parks and cultivate them ourselves. Grew a lot of the early plantings ourselves from material that was local provenance anyway. Later on, we began planting interesting trees, I think you'd call it. They range from they're all native trees, but essentially the species diverged a bit. And then still later, we decided that if our heirs and successors were going to inherit this, then we better give them some commercial, at least a way of covering the rent. So we started planting some very high value timber that might end up being becoming wood turning material, or certainly they're species which today are very, very sought after by wood craftsmen. And we thought, well, at least they all fit. They're all natives too. So there's some red cedar, Tuna ciliata, there's some hoop pines, and quite a lot of Grevillea robusta, silky oaks, all of which are in demand by wood turners. And we hope that our children and grandchildren, or probably our grandchildren, the rate they're growing, we'll be able to harvest those. We took out a forestry covenant on the whole place, which allows us to select and choose logs out of it and sell them at some stage down in the future.
I've got another one here from Michael. Michael, I'm not sure who Hill is it. Is there a link with Weston's arboreta and the 40 trees and shrubs the Canberra settlers were gifted from with their homes post-war? And did Weston's arboreta help make the list up? Also, was the Derby arboreta, I just lost that one.
Oh, was the Derby arboreta gated?
Like gated, that's it. Yeah.
No, it's a public park, and you can still read into the landscape. It totally surrounds the Yarralumla nursery, the government nursery, which is still there and still producing wonderful trees. The Yarralumla nursery recently produced a very large collection of trees to reconstruct Northbourne Avenue after the tram went in. In my view, the wrong species, but I won't go into that here. But anyway, they grew quite advanced seedlings which were transplanted into that site. They're a very good nursery, and they still have all of Charles Weston's records. And luckily, because the buildings are all likely to burn down in the next time there's a fire sometime there, we've got them on digitised, so at least they'll be saved. The arboreta, the trees collections around the outside of that are still accessible. You can walk around. It's an open park and accessible. The only part that is slight, they don't worry too much. The golf course will let you walk around, but they might get a bit sniffy about if you walk down their fairways. They get a bit twitchy.
Has anyone else got any burning questions? I'm just conscious that it's after 7. We had quite a lot of different comments, but Stuart or Colleen, you had quite a few comments in there. Is there anything you want to add? Or
I don't know if you want to mention Ken Eldridge or perhaps Bob Bowden as tree kind of acolytes or followers from perhaps Weston and Pryor.
Yeah, well,
more experiments too in a way.
Great service. 2 great people who I was very lucky to know both of them for many, many years and be a close friend of them. Rob went on, of course, to become, besides being a student of Lindsay Pryor, so he became the director of the Australian National Botanic Gardens and bred. And I'm pleased to say one of the forests on the National Arboretum is a cultivar of Quercus palustris, the pin oak.
Yep.
Rob solved a really tricky problem, and the Arboretum exemplifies or shows to the public how that problem can be solved. Rob bred over many years using ordinary selection techniques, a way around the problem that pin oaks have, which is that the last year's leaves stay on after they do their red thing. They stay on and stay brown and dead, and you end up with dead leaves all over your tree all winter. If you want winter sun, you can't have it. So Rob selected, and there's a plantation on the National Arboretum of his cultivar, which is now available commercially, called Freefall, lovely name. And Freefall is a wonderful memorial to Rob's work. Well, Ken Eldridge is memorialised also because one of the forests on the National Arboretum has his one of the varieties of Pinus radiata that he collected from the Baja California originally. So there's a plantation of his
right.
Original cultivars, one of his original cultivars of the Arboretum.
He introduced me to Yarralumna Nursery and the Westbourne Woods. He used to take volunteer leading walks around explaining some of those trees and some of that history to interested bods like me.
Yeah, well, there's a little plantation on the golf course. We persuaded the golf course horticulturalists to plant a little memorial plantation to Ken Eldridge after he died, and we have half a dozen of each of the 3 species of subspecies, I should say, of Pinus radiata there.
Lovely.
okay, is there any more questions? I think we probably have one more. It's nearly 7:10. We're all done. Well, Max, that was really amazing. Thank you very much. It's certainly an insight into an area that a lot of us perhaps aren't so familiar with as garden history type people, and certainly look forward to coming up to Canberra again the next time and having a look, which I'm hoping to do fairly soon. So thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you at our picnic on the 8th of December with Tim Entwistle in the Botanic Gardens, Melbourne, the Arid Gardens. And if you're not a member of Garden History Society, please go onto our website and join. It's a fantastic society and you'll learn heaps of things and meet lots of really interesting people. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max.
Here's Max. Terrific.
Great work. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you, Max.
Bye.
Thank you, Max.
Bye.
And thanks,